Well, that was the bell, so that means it's time to start. Usually, we'll go ahead and get going. There's not even everybody up talking this morning, so that's good. This morning we're continuing our study of the letters of John, and we're going to get into 1 John today. Now, we've covered a lot of the introductory material for this letter already, both in the overview of all of these back on the very first lesson, which has been a few weeks ago now. We've also touched on it in passing in looking at 2 John and 3 John, since, as we said, all three of these are linked thematically. They also have at least some links in terms of the approximate time period they were written, probably even a literary relationship in terms of why they were sent and where they were sent. So we use 2 John and 3 John in a lot of ways as sort of introductions to this book. So we don't need to rehash all of that. We know the author already. We know it's the Apostle John. That's both according to tradition and it's according to internal evidence too. One of the things, we'll see it today, and we'll talk about this frequently as we go along working our way through this letter. One of the things that really stands out is the relationship that this letter has to the Gospel of John. You find a lot of the same terminology used. You find a lot of the same themes there, and I think that's helpful. If we have, we're not going to be just dependent on John's gospel, but I do think it helps to reference it from time to time because it points us to the sort of the thought world of John the Apostle, the way he approaches issues, the way that he writes, the vocabulary that he uses, and sometimes that can help to clarify things for us. It'll inform the way that we understand this letter. We also know, secondly, other big thing we've talked about, we know that John was dealing with false teachers in the church, or in particular, probably the churches, plural, that he had some degree of oversight over within Asia Minor. According to tradition, John was in Ephesus at this point in his life. We know, for instance, from Revelation, that he gets that vision from Jesus, and as part of that, he sends letters to those 7 churches in Asia Minor. Probably they're within the orbit that he has some degree of influence over, and likely this false doctrine is a threat to all of these congregations in that area. Now, we saw that dealt with specifically in 2 John already when he's warning against receiving these false teachers. Don't give them a platform. Don't welcome them into your house, because then you're bidding Godspeed to their evil deeds, as the King James says. You're encouraging them. But it's something that he deals with at length here in 1 John, and that's going to be good for us to keep in mind, even if we don't get into that explicitly this morning. Although I do want us to talk a little bit more about that now, just to refresh our memory, since it's been some weeks since we dealt with this, and I know not everybody was here for that very first lesson. I don't think we need to construct with certainty the exact sort of false doctrine that John was dealing with. I mean, that might be helpful for us. Sure, it might help us to understand this a little bit better if we knew exactly what he was dealing with. But that was the goal of a lot of scholarship on this letter in the last century, the 20th century in particular, trying to look at this book, read between the lines, look at the historical evidence, what we know about the church in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, and try to say, okay, what exactly is this false doctrine, this false teaching that John's combating here? I don't think we have to understand that exactly or have to come up with a hypothesis in order to understand this book. I also think, as I said in that first lesson some weeks ago now, I think if we get too fixated, if we fall too in love with our own reconstruction of things here, there's a danger of it actually leading to misinterpretation, because we can say, okay, this is the way I understand it, this is my hypothesis, and then we read everything in that light. Even contrary bits of evidence, maybe we try to shoehorn it in there and make it all fit. And then it sort of becomes circular. We have our reconstruction, we read the text through that lens, and everything has to fit within that reconstruction, and it can lead to some bad results, I think. So just keeping it to a minimum, what can we say for certain about these false teachers? And of course, we're going to come across this as we work our way through the text in the coming weeks. But I think it's good for us to keep this historical situation in the back of our minds, because even when it's not at the forefront of what John says, it's still there lurking in the background for why he writes this. We're going to see that even today in the preface, in the first 4 verses, that this false doctrine is there influencing what he says and the way that he says it. So, what we can say for certain is there's some sort of disagreement that had occurred in the churches John wrote to. It seems specifically that it came from the church that John himself was a member of, that they went out from us, he says. And so he's concerned in writing to these other congregations in the area that they adhere to right belief, right teaching, right doctrine, right practice as far as Jesus goes, because in particular, this all has to do with the nature of Jesus. Sometimes these false teachers are called cessationists, and that's because it seems that they left the church. They left the faith. Chapter 2, verse 18, John says, "Children, it is the last hour. And as you've heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us," he says, "but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out, that it might become plain that they all are not of us." So these had gone out from the church. They'd left the faith in some sense, and then they're trying to spread their false doctrine to other congregations. They're evangelistic about it. They're really false missionaries. And that's what he's dealing with there in 2 John and maybe even to some extent in 3 John. But one of the things that they're doing, they were teaching, they were denying that Jesus is the Christ. Chapter 2, verse 22, "Who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist." There's that word again, those who've gone out from us, these Antichrist. "He who denies the Father and the Son." In particular, you go to chapter 4, and we see that they denied that Jesus had come in a body of flesh. "Beloved, do not believe every spirit," this is chapter 4, verse 1, "but test the spirits to see whether they're from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist." That word again, linking all of these, "which you heard was coming and now is in the world already." So these Antichrists had gone out from us. They were denying that Jesus is the Christ. In particular, they were denying in some sense that he had come in the flesh. And if we were to ask who these false teachers were, they do have some commonalities with some doctrines that we know about from later on. In particular, in the 2nd century, even into the 3rd century, it could be that they were early Gnostics. Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis. It means knowledge, in particular experiential knowledge. The idea is secret, special knowledge, that most of us as Christians, we only understand things on the surface level. We're not enlightened. We're not privy to this sort of great insight. But if you were one of the initiated into this gnosis, into this secret knowledge, they would reveal all of these mysteries that Jesus had passed down and then were filtered only through those elect, and you needed to be able to understand that to really know what he was getting at. It does seem to have some similarities with that, with their claims of having knowledge that John, as an apostle, is not privy to, that somehow they were initiated into this through some select disciple of Jesus. In some strains of Gnosticism, for instance, Judas was actually the one enlightened apostle. He was the one who had been privy to Jesus' secrets. He had done everything on Jesus' command, and he passed down the knowledge. There's all these different strains of this belief. But one of the things that characterized Gnostic thought in general was a real dualistic outlook on the world. That is a sharp split between spirit and flesh, between spirit and matter. Spirit is good, matter is evil. And so what we want to try to do is to escape from this prison of our bodies. It has a lot in common with some strains of Greek philosophy. And that could lead in a few different directions, but one direction that it led for some Gnostics was a denial that there's any sort of law that we're subject to at all. That is, the way that you prove that you're enlightened and that you understand that the body is nothing, it's unimportant. You go out and you sin just as much as you want to, because it shows that you understand this is really all an illusion. It's not what it's about. And that could be behind John dealing with their claim to be sinless. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Maybe that's what's going on here, that their spirits remain pure while they indulge the flesh. More specifically, sometimes 1 John has been read against the error that was known as Docetism. That is, that Jesus only seemed to have a fleshly body. He only appeared to be physically human, but actually he was pure spirit. That was all an illusion, a phantasm. So that has some commonalities with Gnostic thought, but it takes it further. It applies that spirit, good, matter, evil to Jesus himself. Because if the flesh is bad, how could God take on flesh? Doesn't make sense from their point of view. So it must have been something that he just projected out there. And that's why John is at pains in this way of thinking. That's why he's at pains to drive home the physicality of Jesus, something we're going to see in the preface today, that we saw him, we heard him, we touched him. Yes, he was absolutely real. It wasn't an illusion. Some have even said more specifically than that John's combating the error of a fellow named Corinthus. Corinthus was a false teacher. We know him from the tradition of the early church, lived in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. And according to this tradition, he was a contemporary of John in Ephesus. And he taught some funny things. He taught what would become known as adoptionism. That is, that there was a man, Jesus of Nazareth. Yes, that was real. He was flesh and blood. But he only became the Christ at his baptism. So he's denying really the incarnation. The Spirit of the Christ came on him there when the Spirit of God descends on him as a dove. That was the Christ entering Jesus of Nazareth. And then sometime before he died, that Spirit of the Christ left him. As I say, that's what became known as adoptionism, this idea that Jesus was not the eternal Son of God. He only became the Son there at his baptism, and then he ceased to be the Son of God when that Spirit left him. My point in going through all of those, any of them actually could be true, because we could read this letter against all of those different false teachings and some others we could come up with that are less commonly put forward, but they would actually all help us to make sense of this letter. They might even be useful in helping us to interpret it. But I don't think it's really necessary for us to say, yeah, it's this one or that one or the other one, because John's primary concern in this letter, and we need to keep this in mind, even if we know he's dealing with false teachers, He's not trying to be an apologist. He's not offering a formal defense of Christian doctrine. He doesn't even specifically address those false doctrines that have invaded the church. That's why we have to guess so much about what exactly it is, because we have these hints reading between the lines of what he says, but he never says explicitly, okay, here's what these guys are teaching, and here point by point is why it's wrong. That we might like it if he presented it that way, but that's not what he does. There was some real historical situation he was dealing with, yes, but we don't know what it was. And so what's far more important is not identifying what he was fighting against, but what he's for. That's what we're concerned with. How does John identify what's true, what's orthodox, what's the right doctrine? That's what matters regardless of the specific false doctrine he was up against. And what we're going to see, we've seen this already in 2nd and 3rd John. He hits on certain themes over and over and over and over again in all three of these letters. Think about, we've seen some of these. Truth, we've seen him talk about that a lot already, haven't we? About how he rejoices when his children are walking in the truth in 3rd John. About how that elect lady has children who are standing firm in the truth. We're going to see that a lot more in 1 John. He talks about love. We know John as the apostle of love. We've seen that in 2nd and 3rd John. 3rd John, he refers to Gaius repeatedly as beloved. 2nd John, he encourages that lady to continue to stand firm in love. Third big theme is righteousness. That is keeping God's commandments. So when we look at those three big themes, that's what's important to him. That's what we need to focus on. That argues against those false doctrines we mentioned, sure, but actually that could argue against a lot of false doctrines, couldn't it? Including some modern day ones that focus on truth and love and righteousness and how all three of those things go together. So what this letter, really all three of these are about, but this one in particular, do we want to know God? Do we want to know truth? Knowing God truly is the overarching theme of this letter, really of all three of them. It's the theme of John's gospel in a lot of ways too, but if you look at 1 John chapter 5, verse 13, I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life. You can have this true knowledge of God and the life that is in Jesus. There is only one true God, the one who sent Jesus Christ into the world. And that's a strong claim to make in the ancient world. What do we know about ancient religions? Paganism. There are many gods. And if you think our modern society is pluralistic, where we think that, well, we're all just on different paths to the same God. Man, in the ancient world, the Romans, for instance, I think I've talked about this before, the Romans had this ceremony where if they were fighting against another city, it wasn't going that well, they would have this elaborate religious ceremony where they would basically try to co-opt the gods of that city, get them to come over to their side. I mean, I'm being somewhat facetious about it, but what it essentially boiled down to is, hey, come on, support Rome. We'll treat you better than these guys ever have. We'll build you a great big temple. We'll offer better sacrifices to you. And so, you know, for instance, from way back in elementary school, the Greek gods, the Roman gods, they viewed them as the same beings, just with different names. That's what the Romans would do. Anytime they went into a new place, they went into Egypt too, they would just say, hey, this sounds a lot like our god, so-and-so. Zeus, that sounds a lot like Jupiter. On and on. This idea that they're all these gods, but really maybe we're all kind of worshiping them under different names. No, John claims there's only one God, the one who sent Christ into the world. The ancient world in some ways is not too different from our own modern world. And so this is just as relevant to us as it was to them. In our spiritually confusing times where there are so many diverse, sometimes even conflicting views of God, where many people believe that it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you're sincere, John writes to his audience to give certainty about Jesus because he wants them to know the truth, and because of that, he wants them to have assurance. And that's just as relevant to us as it was to them. The specifics of the situation they were dealing with might be different from ours, but the big picture sounds a lot like our modern world. So this morning I want to get into the text by focusing on the preface or the prologue. That's chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and really I think probably because of time, we're not even going to properly get outside of verse number 1. That may seem like slow going. That's a lot slower than we'll normally go. It's slower than we normally go in other classes you've been in, definitely slower than we'll normally go through this class, but we're going to talk about why this is important in a moment. 1 John 1, beginning verse 1. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And we're writing these things so that our joy may be complete. 1 John is often given as the first real translation exercise to baby Greek students. We did that when I was in graduate school at the end of my first year, and that's not atypical. They'll do that in a lot of seminaries or graduate programs. You'll have your first semester, well, you'll start to learn just a whole lot of vocabulary. You'll learn the rudiments of grammar. In the second semester, you'll get into translation work. But we did not. I found it. I actually dug it out. Maybe I'll use it some in this course, although probably not too much because the translation work's not that great. But it was sort of a capstone to that first year. We did it at the end of our second semester, translated all of 1 John. And the reason that that's so commonly done is that the vocabulary is pretty simple. It's not words that you don't know. You're not having to go and look up things. You probably already got these memorized. I mean, just think about the words that we've encountered here in these first 4 verses. Things like beginning, word, life, light. You can imagine those are probably words that you memorize early on. They're common. You run across them all the time. And not only that, 1 John is pretty repetitive. You find these same words repeated over and over again, which is good for a beginning Greek student because, it's just going to reinforce it, drill it down. And the syntax usually is not terribly complicated. But that surface level simplicity belies just how complex this really is, because the real question here, especially for this first paragraph, but for the book in general, the real question is, okay, you know what it says, that's great, but what does it mean? And that's what we're really getting at, right? The meaning. You contrast this to Paul's letters, for instance. You don't have to know Greek. Just think about when you've studied Paul's letters in the past. Now, Paul sometimes, he might chase rabbits. He might go off in some other train of thought. But in general, Paul is very logical. He's very orderly in the way that he writes. And even if he sort of wanders off on one point, he's going to get back to the main point eventually. There might be digressions, but he's going to go back to where he started, and he's going to go through here, and you're going to get the idea of what he's arguing. 1 John is not a good book to outline. That's why, I didn't bother with an outline of 2nd or 3rd John because they're so short, but generally, like with Job, we had an outline. First John, the reason we don't have an outline is because I don't think there is a good outline of it. It's almost circular. Because what we're going to see is John returning to these same themes, these same ideas again and again and again, and making his same point in different ways. Charles Swindoll compares 1 John to a symphony, whereas Paul is like a logical argument. This is like a symphony where he keeps returning to the same theme or the same melody, just with different variations upon it. And I think that's a good way to think of it, but it's also why it makes this so difficult to try to trace the progression of the thought. It's particularly true of this preface, these first 4 verses, which I think helps introduce us to this idea of complexity. You know, we read this, and what I read a moment ago, it might have seemed pretty straightforward in English. It's not straightforward in Greek, and it presents us with a whole host of questions. For one thing, the opening here is maybe the most unusual opening of any book in the entire Bible. For starters, it doesn't begin like a typical letter. That should jump out at us as obvious after we've already studied 2nd and 3rd John. We've said those are pretty typical letters, correct? And do you remember how they begin? The elder to so-and-so, to the elect lady, or to the beloved Gaius. That's how first century letters begin, with the sender identifying himself, within the person that he's addressing, within some sort of salutation following that, greetings, could be as simple as that. And then typically there would be some sort of well-wish, like for Gaius's health, for instance, or there would be a prayer of thanksgiving. That's the way Paul commonly adapts it, but it's pretty formulaic. Bryant to Jerry, greetings. I pray that you may be in good health. That's the way basically every letter, there's variations on it, basically every standard first century letter starts it. This clearly doesn't start that way at all. And that indicates that John didn't think of this as a typical letter, at least not a letter in the usual sense. It's more like a sermon. In that sense, the only other letter that begins this way in the New Testament is Hebrews. Hebrews jumps in like that. We call that the letter to the Hebrews, and Hebrews actually does have an ending on it like a letter, but it just jumps, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners has spoken to our fathers in times past, hath in these last days spoken to us through his Son, so on and so forth. So maybe it's to be thought of like a sermon. Some have suggested maybe we should think of it, maybe John intended it as a companion to his gospel account, because maybe some of those false teachings were rooted in misunderstandings of his gospel, where he talks about Jesus as the eternal Word. And some of this language seems to be intentionally recalling that to mind, as we'll talk about in a minute, but he's offering us a twist on that. But at any rate, that's unusual. The other thing that's really weird, and I don't know if this jumps out to us in English or not, but this is the only book to begin with a relative pronoun. That which in the ESV, or what, it could also be translated. What was from the beginning, what we heard, what we've seen with our eyes, etc. So it begins with a relative pronoun. That is odd, to say the least. I mean, that would be odd English. Well, it's odd Greek word order, too. He just jumps in with his relative pronoun. We don't even know what it's referencing. And then there are 3 more of those in that first verse alone. In fact, these first 4 verses are probably, most scholars think, it's all one sentence in Greek. Now, it's divided up a lot more in English. I mean, this is going a paragraph, but the problem with ancient Greek, even what we work on from translating, like in classes, or if I were doing translation work, what we have is a modern-day Greek text where it has it all split up into verses and paragraphs and such. But actually, if you look at a Greek manuscript, it's all capital letters with no punctuation, no spaces between words. It's just letters one after another. So there's some art as much as science to trying to figure out exactly where there should be the end of a sentence, the beginning of a new one, the flow of paragraphs, so on and so forth. But just based on the grammar here, this is all one sentence. And you actually don't get to the main verb until all the way down in verse number 3. So you've got all these relative pronouns in these clauses, that which is from the beginning, which we've heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we've looked upon and have touched with our hands. And then we have almost this parenthetical break concerning the word of life. In the ESV, we actually have dashes there. But it's set off in some way, parentheses, dash, however you want to think about it. He's interrupting his main train of thought. This preface has a notorious reputation among scholars. Just to give you some idea, Raymond Brown calls it a grammatical obstacle course. C.H. Dodd says the sentence is not good Greek, and it's only by paraphrase that it can be rendered into good English. J.L. Holden says that these first few verses of 1 John, quote, can only be described as, formerly at least, bordering upon incoherence and lapse into grammatical impossibilities. So it's hard to understand. And that's the point I want us to get at. In Greek, this is hard to understand, and it's made doubly so by the fact that even if we understand the words and their relationship to each other, these concepts that he's conveying are extraordinarily difficult. So in the last 10 or 15 minutes this morning, we're going to get, and we've already have gotten, we're going to get more technical than we normally would, and don't worry, we're not going to do the whole class like this, okay? But we do need to understand here, what is John talking about? Because this is really a key to the whole book. It's introducing us his topic. What's he talking about? And there's several questions under that. You know, we just jump in with these relative pronouns. So what are these relative pronouns referring to? He says it's from the beginning. What's he talking about? What is from the beginning reference? Who does the we refer to? Did you notice that this is all in the second person? This is on the first person plural, I should say. We have heard. We have seen with our eyes. We have looked upon. We've touched with our hands. As we might say around here, does John have a frog in his pocket or what? Who is the we that he's referencing? So let's run through these questions here. First of all, what is the referent of these pronouns? What was from the beginning, what we've heard, what we've seen, what we've looked upon, what we've touched with our hands. It's clear, what we can get from the gist of this, even without nailing this all down exactly. It's clear from the overall content that John is basing his authority on eyewitness knowledge. Would you agree with that? Can we at least all see that? We've seen it, we've heard it, we've touched it. So it's natural for us to just read this as we are the eyewitnesses of Jesus. That is, if we want to paraphrase this, we heard Jesus, we saw Jesus, we touched Jesus, we looked at him. That might be the most obvious way to take this in English, but the problem is all of these pronouns, remember Greek is a gendered language. You have masculine and feminine nouns. You also have neuter nouns and pronouns. These pronouns are all neuter. If they were referring to Jesus, the person, they would have to be masculine. So these can't refer grammatically directly to Jesus. So I think the most likely way to understand this is that he's referring more broadly to the gospel message. That is, to an abstract idea. That's why it's neuter. Everything we know about Jesus. So yeah, that includes the man Jesus himself, yes, but really the message about him, what he taught and what's been taught about him. He's talking then in categories beyond just sensory experience, beyond just physical observation of Jesus. Yes, it includes that, but it's more than that. It's deeper than that. And actually that makes sense just with the wording that's used, because after all, what we've heard, what we've seen, what we've looked upon, what we've touched, it's concerning the word of life, more on that in the moment, what this word of life is. But you think about the language that he uses, a word of life. Well, you can hear a word. You can see a word, even if it's printed, but touch a word, I mean, I guess we could argue Braille, but of course that hasn't been invented yet. So the point is, the language itself suggests a knowledge of Jesus that is deeper and is richer than just sensory experience. It includes that, yeah, but it's more than that. Second big question. He says that this knowledge, what we're talking about, it's that which was from the beginning. Most of these pronouns refer to perception, what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've touched, but it begins with that which was from the beginning. So the question is, the beginning of what? There are a couple of other books of the Bible that reference the beginning at the beginning of their books. Can we think of what those are? Genesis, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What's the other one? Just think about it, especially in relation to 1 John. Yeah, the Gospel of John. In fact, John 1:1 echoes Genesis 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. There are obvious similarities between the beginning of John's Gospel and the beginning of this letter here. That seems to me to be intentional. That's one more reason why, as we've already said, it's good to use one to interpret the other. John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. That clearly is trying to call to mind Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In fact, not only does it begin the same way in the beginning, but we have reference to creation there in John chapter 1. Don't we? All things were made by him, by that eternal word. Without him was not anything made that was made. So, interpreting this verse in that light means that what we have heard, what we've seen, what we've touched is the message about the Word, the Logos, that agent of creation who made all things. Now, I think that's right, but I would just give us one note of caution here. This same prepositional phrase, which to be clear is from the beginning, not in the beginning, so it's a little different. But this same prepositional phrase occurs elsewhere in the letter, and there it refers to the beginning of the Christian life. Chapter 2, verse 7, "Beloved, I'm writing you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you had from the beginning." Verse 23, no one who denies, I wrote 23, but it must be 24. Yeah. "Let what you heard from the beginning abide in you. If what you heard from the beginning abides in you, then you too will abide in the Son and in the Father." There's also a reference in chapter 3. There's a reference in 2 John. So if we interpreted it this way, that would mean that what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've touched, etc., is the same truth that Christians have known from the beginning of their Christian life. That is, from the day that they came to believe. It's also possible to take this as the beginning of the gospel. And for John, if you go back to his gospel account, the word of life, that's what this is all about. So that would be when Jesus first began to preach, when he first began to perform miracles. I say all that to say that one of the characteristics of John's gospel and this letter is lots of wordplay. He does that sort of thing a lot. And I think probably he is intentionally suggesting multiple senses of this beginning here. I do think he's intentionally recalling our minds the beginning of his gospel, and then by extension to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. But the point is that this same eternal Word, who is life, was revealed in the man, Jesus. The temporal focus is on his lifetime, but it alludes to his pre-existence. That pre-existent Word, the one that, remember, the false teachers he's combating, they're denying he came in the flesh. John says this Word, who did exist from the beginning, we've heard him. We've seen him with our eyes. He became flesh. Remember, the focus of this letter, at least in part, is on that physical identity of Jesus. And I think that becomes clear with the repetition of these verbs about sensory experience. We've heard, we've touched him with our hands. There are actually two words for sight. You probably noticed that we've seen him with our eyes. We looked upon him. There's a slightly different emphasis here. The first one is on just like seeing, sensory perception. But the second one here is on what we've perceived about him. So again, we're going above, we're going beyond just sensory perception. We've seen him, we've come to know, we've come to understand him, grasping the true significance of his life, his death, his resurrection. So there's a definite reference to eyewitness testimony here. Yeah. But the truth of the gospel is more than just historical facts, isn't it? It's about grasping the significance of those facts, believing those facts. That's what perceiving it is. Then there's the question of we. Who is the one making this claim? It's possible to take this as a genuine plural. That is, maybe John is referencing not only himself, but the other apostles. We as a community were eyewitnesses. Sometimes scholars today will interpret this as a reference to John's community. That is the group of churches that he had some degree of oversight over, those faithful ones who preserved this teaching they got from John. But 1 John was clearly written by one person. You go through the rest of this book and you'll see that more often than not, by far, it's a singular first person that he uses. So I think this is probably a plural, we might call it a plural of majesty, a plural of authority. It indicates his position. We see this used in modern times, and it was used in the ancient world this way too, of royalty, right? You ever watched The Crown or something like that? And you see in official proclamations, the queen will refer to herself as we, or it is our will, our pleasure. I think it's something like that. It could also be an editorial we. We also see that usage in the modern world as well as the ancient world. That's a convention where to use I just sounds too self-focused. I use that sometimes even in bulletin articles, but you'll see that in newspapers, magazines, things like that. So we're familiar with both of those usages in modern English. They both exist in the ancient world too. I don't think this is a direct reference to an actual community. It's just John referring to himself as we here. The last question before we wrap up has to do with what John is proclaiming, this word of life. It's natural, again, to read this against the background of the first chapter of John's Gospel, where we have the Word, the Logos, that is Jesus, the living Word of God. But remember, I've already said this, remember one more time, the pronouns here can't refer to Jesus himself because they're not masculine. For that matter, they can't refer to Word itself either because the word is a masculine word. So, it seems that, again, this is broader. He's referencing the gospel, the message about Jesus, all of its contents. Yeah, his life, but also everything that he taught, everything that we know about him. The Word who is life, the Word who brings life. You'll notice that the focus isn't on word here, it's actually on life. It's life that he picks up in the next verse. The life was made manifest, and we've seen it. And that's connected back at the end with this assurance of eternal life. We read this verse already, but 5:13, why does he say, I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God. Why? That you may know that you have eternal life. That seems to be the focus. So, all that's to say, there's a lot going on in just this very first verse. John claims a source of knowledge that cannot be matched by those who were not eyewitnesses themselves or who just ignored his and the other apostles' eyewitness. Second, he says that which was from the beginning, that eternal word, has become a physical reality, capable of being heard, being seen, being touched. The whole point here is who has authority to speak about Christ and what is the content of that message. Both of these are major issues in this letter. Who knows the truth about Jesus? Is it these false teachers or is it John? And what is the content of that teaching about his identity? That's what we're going to see unfold throughout the rest of this letter. We're out of time. Actually, 2 minutes past. They held the bell for me. That was nice. Any questions or comments here before we wrap it up? Okay. Thanks for your attention. We'll move through this faster, I promise, next week.